الحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على سيد الخلق وأشرف المرسلين سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه ومن اتبعه بإحسان إلى يوم الدين. اللهم لا علم لنا إلا ما علمتنا إنك أنت العليم الحكيم. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Holy Quran, ربنا آتنا في الدنيا حسنة وفي الآخرة حسنة وقنا عذاب النار. What does that mean? It means that we need to understand what Islam is about. Islam is about giving you the highest quality of life, spiritually, materialistically, in this life, and putting you, meanwhile, on the straight path to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, to the ultimate prize of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that is Jannah, where everything, after we pass away, after we stand before our Creator, everything is available for the wishing. Pleasure, unlimited and eternal. So Islam is not about, well, there's some burden that you put in your back and some hardship, and then later on after you die, there's this great thing. No, it's the highest quality of living now and the eternally pleasurable, best life that you can possibly imagine and not imagine in the hereafter. To seek that, to gain that knowledge and that wisdom that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sent to us with His mercy to mankind, who is Prophet Muhammad SAW, we need to pick these pieces of wisdom as to how to process our lives according to Islam to gain that benefit. The hasana in this dunya and the hasana in the hereafter. One of the great narrators of the hadith of Prophet Muhammad SAW, you'd be surprised, that is Umar ibn Khattab radiallahu anhu. Why I say that? Because Umar ibn Khattab radiallahu anhu and also Abdullah ibn Mas'ud, they were afraid and they feared Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala specifically from zalal. Meaning that they did not like to narrate hadiths or quotations of Prophet Muhammad ﷺ in fear that they misquote one word or say something wrong and they will be punished by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Yet, there's some quotations of Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, some sayings of Prophet Muhammad ﷺ that were so significantly important that the same fear of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala forced him to actually go ahead and narrate him to Muslims, to benefit Muslims with it. So one of these hadith that actually is a key for us to gain that tremendous benefit in our life, on our way inshaAllah to paradise, is the hadith of Umar ibn Khattab radiallahu anhu in Sahih al-Tirmidhi that was corrected by Shaykh Nasruddin al-Albani. The hadith مرفوعا لو أنكم كنتم توكلون على الله حق توكله لرزقكم كما ترزق الطير تغدو خماصا وتروح بطانا. If you, humans, people, did truly rely upon Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the true reliance, you should rely upon Him, He would have given you your sustenance, your risk, your fortunes, like He gives it to the birds. They leave every day on an empty stomach and they come back home on a full stomach. First question, what is true reliance? Second question, why specifically the birds? Why it's so important that I should look up to leaving on an empty stomach and coming back on a full stomach? I have food, I eat, I have sustenance. Why would that be exceptional? The exceptional thing with the birds is that everything that the birds want out of their life is safety and food. Think about it, safety and food. But when they truly rely upon Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala give these animals who do not have intelligence, do not have weather reports to tell them how the world is like this morning. They don't know when it's going to rain or snow or there's going to be storms and all kind of dangers. Yes, they go out, they do their leg work, but their true reliance upon Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala does get them back home safely with everything that they want out of life. Their safety and the food that they seek. Alright, then learning that if I truly rely upon Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, I would get everything that I want. Taking the birds as example, the next question is, which was the first one, what is the true reliance upon Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? SubhanAllah, one of the jewels of the Fatiha, the great verse that many scholars would say it represents and summarizes Islam, إِيَّاكَ نَعْبُدُ وَإِيَّاكَ نَسْتَعِينُ, about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, our one mighty creator, that only you we rely upon, and it's only you whom we worship. So what is true reliance? True reliance is that I truly believe in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. A lot of people would say, of course I believe in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. I'm not a Muslim if I don't believe in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. What do you mean that I need to truly believe in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? Well, the question is different than what probably 90% of the people would understand it to be. I am not asking if one believes in the existence of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, but I'm asking if you do believe in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala himself. Meaning, do you believe that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the ultimate provider? Do you believe that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the most generous? Do you believe that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is watching everything? Do you believe that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the only protector? And so on and so forth, of all the limitless attributes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Because a lot of people would tell you, yes, I do believe in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Yet, as soon as no one is watching and there's some harm to be committed, they just do it as if in their mind, practically, they don't believe that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is watching. Or more, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has angels that are recording everything. If they did believe in that, they would have not dared commit the haram and disobey Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala before Him, because He does watch you. Why is knowing the attributes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would affect me relying upon Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? Exactly the same way. If I believe that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the only provider, not my boss, not the CEO of the company, not my supervisor, but it is actually Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala who provides. If I believe that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the only one who protects, if I believe that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the utmost just a provider and giver and ruler of the universe, then I would be very easily, automatically, without thinking, relying only upon Him. I remember the story when someone had a new boss, and people started to go to the secretary, wanted to know what pleases that man and what kind of gift or things that they need to do to be in his good side so they can get the promotion or whatever that they can get out of him. And when they did all this lobbying with the secretary, they discovered that that boss actually was fired by his other boss. It is significant because, well, if we do that for someone who can get fired himself and his boss can get fired and so on and so forth, what are we doing with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, who is our great provider? So when we truly rely upon Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and seek only His approval and seek only appeasing Him and obeying Him, then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would provide for us. What am I saying? Simply, in simple words, the key for you to live the ultimate quality of life, where you get everything that is good for you provided to you by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala just for doing the legwork. We all work, we all seek, we all have admirations. Some people are tremendously successful, some people are not. Some people realize some success, but they have the worst quality of life. Success to them was materialistic, but spiritually, they're totally bankrupt. If I want all of it, I want success, I want spiritual happiness, I want quality of life, then the only way to do that is to obey Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Stay away from the haram and do the halal of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Simply, in Arabic, لا راحة إلا بالطاعة. There's no comfort except by obeying Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. When you obey Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, you put yourself in the true reliance upon Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, because He is the only utmost reference that you have. It's not money that rules you. When you see some more money, you're willing to do the haram. It is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, no matter what amount of money it is, that you obey, and you abandon anything if it is against the obedience of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The word ta'ah to a lot of people is something that is negative. What do you mean? My will is not free. I'm not a free man. I'm going to do things against my will, and so on and so forth. Of all these pretentious negative things that we are taught through our materialistic life. Ta'ah is to actually fine-tune yourself to the existence that you live in. Ta'ah is like when you get an AM radio or an FM radio and you keep flipping the channels and you hear a lot of static until you get to exactly the same wavelength that tunes to the radio station that you want to listen to, and all of a sudden it's crystal clear and the sound is stereo and amplified and it is perfect. So what is the wavelength of our existence so we can get that tranquility, that quality of life? That wavelength is you obeying Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala of what He ordered and what He forbade us to do. A lot of people forget our nature. When I was born, no one came to me and said, when do you want to be born? How should I be shaped, and what face should I look like when I'm born or when I'm grown up? What age, what parents should I be born to? What date should I be born in? Nobody asked my permission. I am created to obey Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. I have absolutely no control of what happens in the world. But I know at the same time that what happens in the world affects me, affects my thinking, affects my quality of life, affects everything. I am created to obey Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The fact that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, my creator, my almighty creator, gave me the ability of informed choice, that does not mean that everything should yield to me, but actually I should choose what makes life yield to me, which is obeying who created me and created life. I liken it, and this is another analogy, is that you as a human being is the correct key for a lock that is life. When you obey Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, you are that correct key. All you have to do is just insert one step, turn it, and all of a sudden you have access and everything is fine. But if you try any other key by disobeying Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and changing the wavelength that you are born to be tuned to, all you have to do is that you're going to be hassling yourself, you're going to break that key, that is yourself, you're going to damage the quality of life and damage your own self, and maybe damage the luck itself, that's the life around you, for people who disobey Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and hurt the people around them and the environment around them, and you get no access. The more you realize your nature, and you only obey Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, you obey no one else. There in itself is your liberty and your quality of life. So again, what Umar ibn Khattab radiallahu anhu is telling us, when we have that true belief in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and by that we truly rely upon Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala by obeying Him and seeking only what we want from Him, then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will provide us tremendously with everything that we want. Tremendous hadith of Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam narrated by Umar ibn Khattab radiallahu anhu. But then it's not just, you know what, you'll get everything that you want and it's that easy without details. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala with His wisdom and mercy even explained to us in further perfect details how empowered we would be in this life on our way inshallah to Jannah. In the Hadith Qudsi that is in Sahih al-Bukhari, Hadithi Abu Hurairah radiallahu anhu. Before we go, for those who do not know Hadith Qudsi, meaning that the meaning comes from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, but through the words of Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. What is the difference between that and the Quran? The Quran is the meaning that is given by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the specific words verbatim of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala Himself. What is the hadith that would give us the detail of how we're gonna change our lives and be tuned and be perfect within the life and the environment that we're in? Hadith Abu Hurairah radiallahu anhu, Sahih al-Bukhari, marfu'a, ما تقرب إلي عبدي بأحب إلي من أداء ما افترضته. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is telling us that you can never get closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala by anything more liked by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala than what He obligated upon us. So, the obligations. You want to get closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? You want to be that obedient to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, then do what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala obligated upon you. And subhanAllah, when you look at the price of you being the person who does what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, creator of heavens and earth, liked, imagine the reward. But then how much does it cost? What did Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala obligate upon us? The shahada that makes us Muslims, how much does that cost? The 5 prayers, how long does one prayer take of your time? 5 minutes, 10 minutes, how much the ablution water cost? How much 5 to 10 minutes in 5 times a day, and maybe it's all 5 minutes, 25 minutes in the whole entire day. How much would that cost you? How many TV commercials that people have watched? How many times they wasted maybe a half an hour, a clip on a cell phone call or a phone call that they would not even remember the following day? How many movies, how many, and so on and so forth, of the time wasting things that are worthless on our scale of good deeds. And subhanAllah, when we pray, we just make ablution, we wash ourselves from the exhaust of the materialistic life, we, subhanAllah, obey Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and pray and recharge our batteries, recharge our spirits, and go refreshed back to work or back to what we're doing. Recently, there was a sister that accepted Islam, and subhanAllah, she accepted Islam by trying to pray like the Muslims before she even said the Shahada. And I asked her, how was it for you? She told me it was such a tremendous feeling that was the primary cause for her to accept Islam. Just the way that we pray. What is the third thing that is obligated by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? Our zakah. What is our zakah? Which is the taxes that we pay in Islam, and compare that to the myriad of taxes that people pay in all the supposedly modern systems made with the limited comprehension of people. Whatever money that is left with you after a year, after all your spending, whatever that you spend, aside from your house and your car, whatever is left for a year that you had no need for, take that and divide it over 40 pieces and give 1 piece to the poor. That's 2.5% of your unspent liquid assets after 1 year. And even that, when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala described it to Prophet Muhammad in the Quran to make us, the Muslims, perform it, He's telling us why we're doing it. You would think, oh, to support the poor. Yes, that's the part where the benefit and the reward from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala comes. But the purpose of it is different. خُذْ مِنْ أَمْوَالِهِمْ صَدَقَةً تُطَهِّرُهُمْ وَتُزَكِّيهِمْ بِهَا. Take from monies of the Muslims a tax, be given as charity to the poor, that you would purify them and endorse them with it. It is for your own benefit. Wallahi, before it is any benefit to the poor. What is the obligations? It's fasting the 30 days of the month of Ramadan. Ask any doctor who read about the research and the myriad of benefits of fasting. There are documentaries about it all over the place. That actually it detoxifies the body, it takes the toxin out of the body, it has tremendous benefit to the body. As a matter of fact, one of the new drugs is resveratrol that they sell on pharmacies nowadays that should help kicks in the longevity gene. Actually, the 2 scientists that discovered it say that actually continued periods of hunger would actually cause the same benefit of longevity and extended lifespan. What do they mean by continued periods of hunger? It is fasting. And it is another scientific miracle of Prophet Muhammad when he said, Sumu tasihhu, in the correct hadith. Fast and you would be healthy. Even that fasting is a tremendous benefit to you. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala obligate upon you, so He would subhanAllah guarantee the benefit that will get to you at the end. And then pilgrimage to whomever and whoever can afford it physically and financially. When you do these obligations, you're only benefiting yourself. Yet, you can never do as a human being created by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala anything that is more beneficiary than you benefiting yourself with these obligations from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That's how you obey Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That's how you truly rely upon Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Is that enough? No. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, with His utmost wisdom and generosity, tell us more. وَمَا زَالَ عَبْدِي يَتَقَرَّبُ إِلَيَّ بِالنَّوَافِلِ, and my worshipper keeps getting closer to me with additional worshipping. And nawafil here, so we don't get into the bid'ah and the innovations of people making up 1,000 rak'ahs and praising Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala 1 billion times and making the religion difficult for people. And nawafilu hiya ziyadatun fil usul. So what is the nafila of salah? To pray additional prayers like Prophet Muhammad used to do. What is the nafila, the additional worshipping of fasting, that you fast every Monday and Thursday like the Prophet did, and the 3 middle month of the Islamic month or the lunar month. What is the nawafil of the obligated charity, that is zakah, is to give more charity to the poor. So it's ziyada fi usul. So some people want to get closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. They want to be loved more by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, because obeying Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is what gets you loved by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So what happened when the worshipper keeps getting closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? مَا زَالَ عَبْدِي يَتَقَرَّبُ إِلَيَّ بِالنَّوَافِلِ حَتَّى أُحِبُّهُ. So you'll be what? In a good stance with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, in a good position, or on Judgment Day? No, you would be loved by the Creator of heavens and earth. When you're not just a Muslim who made it to Jannah, when you are one of the Muslims that were specially loved by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Imagine the highest level of Jannah you're going to be in. Subhanallah. Utmost benefit for you on earth with these worshipping and that obedience to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and the spiritual satisfaction and the reward with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in Jannah is tremendous. Is that enough? No. We're talking about the generosity of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in telling you what do you need to do simply and easily to be a worshipper of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and at the same time He's giving you details to persuade you and encourage you to benefit none other than yourself. What happens? Now you're loved by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. فَأَكُونُ سَمْعَهُ الَّذِي يَسْمَعُ بِهِ وَأَكُونُ بَصَرُهُ الَّذِي يُبْصِرُ بِهِ وَأَكُونُ يَدَهُ الَّتِي يَبْطِشُ بِهَا وَأَكُونُ رِجْلَيْهِ الَّذِي يَمْشِي عَلَيْهَا. The power of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will aid you. He will be the hearing that you would hear with. You would hear the truth. He would give you the basira. You would see things for what they truly are, not what they seem like. The power of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will help you. وَأَكُونُ يَدَهُ الَّتِي يَبْطِشُ بِهَا. And He would be, subhanallah, when your hand is striking something for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the power of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, as if the power of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala comes into your hand and your hand would be hitting with it. And the legs that you're standing on, you would be standing on the support and the sustenance of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Tremendous. And subhanallah, the examples are many. When Ibrahim alayhi salam, and he was the only Muslim of his time at the time. He was the nation of Islam at the time. And his people seek to destroy him. What they did is that they had a huge fire and they took him and they threw him into the middle of the fire. What happened? He's a prophet of God. He's so loved by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. He is one of the most loved people by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. There are the prophets of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. قُلْنَا يَا نَارُ كُونِي بَرْدًا وَسَلَامًا عَلَى إِبْرَاهِيمَ. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala ordered the laws of nature to be suspended. He ordered the fire itself to be cool and safe for Ibrahim alayhi salam. So before his people, within the blazing fire, he was as if he was sitting in an air-conditioned room. Nothing happened. Actually, it was cool for him. That's when you're loved by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. You want to see an example by when your hand is aided by the power of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. When Musa alayhi salam have done everything, worshiping Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, struggling for his sake, and he's standing by the seashore. The army of the most tyrannical ruler is behind him, and he would drown if he goes further. What happened? And as we have inspired Musa to hit the shore with his stick, a very small, worthless stick. And what happened? The sea was parted into two gigantic mountains of water where Musa alayhi salam passed, and the Muslims of his time, his followers, and then when the Pharaoh wanted to pass, he drowned. Was it the stick? Was it the hand of Musa alayhi salam? No, it was the power of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala when it was the time of action, when something had to be done, and the hand of Musa alayhi salam with that lousy stick, with that worthless stick, was aided by the power of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. An entire sea was parted, an entire army of the enemies of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was drowned. He was loved by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. He obeyed Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. He tuned himself into the obedience and the existence that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created him for. Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, when he wanted to immigrate to Medina, the infidels of Quraysh, the pagans, gathered a young man from every tribe and they wanted them all to go kill him, assassinate him while he was asleep in his bed. Imagine, not by one sword, but so many swords from every tribe of the nation. But that is Sayyid al-Khalq wa Ashraf al-Mursaleen. That's the last prophet of God who is to guide all mankind to the guidance of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. What happened? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Quran, وَجَعَلْنَا مِن بَيْنِ أَيْدِيهِمْ سَدًّا وَمِنْ خَلْفِهِمْ سَدًّا فَأَغْشَيْنَاهُمْ فَهُمْ لَا يُبْصِرُونَ. And we have put veils before him and behind him, so they were blind, they couldn't see. And Prophet Muhammad ﷺ walked amongst themselves. They were standing like statues with their evil, with their swords. وَحَثَى فِي وُجُوهِهِمُ التُّرَابِ. He took the dust and threw it in their faces as if they were statues, and he walked through them, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala saved him. He was the most beloved by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So to summarize it up, you wanna, inshaAllah, to live the highest quality of life, to be loved by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, to gain the ultimate prize and ultimate benefit that you can get from this world, on your way on the straight path of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to the ultimate prize, all you have to do is to obey Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Look in the Quran, the words of your Creator, what He tell you. وَمَا خَلَقَتُ الْجِنَّ وَالْإِنسَ إِلَّا لِيَعْبُدُونَ. I have created men and spirits for one reason and one reason only, to worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And worshiping Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is not just to do some ritualistic thing in one building once a week, and that's worshiping Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. No, to worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, to fear Him, to use Him as a reference, to rely upon Him, to obey Him in everything that you do, especially when you're dealing with other people. Finally, we need to ask ourselves that one question: why does people not obey Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? And some of them are Muslims. They know, but subhanAllah, they don't obey Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We mentioned the first reason is that they believe in the existence of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, but they don't occupy their hearts with the abilities of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So they're not truly believing in Him and His abilities, they just believe in the name, or that He exists. But there's a disconnect in their mind between His existence and His abilities and His rights upon them. The second reason is that people hasten things. People think that, you know what, if I take shortcuts, if I disobey Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in this, I will get more risk, more benefit, more money, more position, more influence when I do this just this one time. Or the other thing. And they keep disobeying Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in chasing what they believe, something that they can get, their risk or their destiny or their fortune. And of course the shaitan is a major help of that. If the shaitan is anything, it is an excuse machine, willing to give you whatever justification, excuse, if you're willing to open yourself to disobeying Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. In that case, we go to the hadith that we want to finish with, inshaAllah, an ultimate wisdom from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala through His Prophet. It is the correct hadith, hadithi Hudayfah ibn al-Yamam fi Sahih al-Targhib, that was corrected by Shaykh Nasruddin al-Albani, marfu'an, أنه لا تموت نفس حتى تستوفي رزقها. Look at the bullets and the pieces of wisdom. No soul will die without getting what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had destined for it to get. When we are in the wombs of our mother and the angels come and blow our soul in our bodies, inside the womb of our mothers, our risk is determined. When are we going to be born? When are we going to die? Are we going to live happily or not? And what exactly we will get. It's known in advance to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It will be done all through our choices and our reactions to the world, but it's all known in advance by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And whatever that risk is, no one will miss. No one dies too young. No one dies too old. No one missed anything. No one just barely caught anything. Whatever that was to hit you is to hit you, and whatever that you missed you was to miss you. So, subhanAllah, the hadith is telling us you're not missing anything. What else is in the hadith? فَاتَّقُوا اللَّهِ. So fear Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. وَأَجْمِلُوا فِي الطَّلَبِ. and ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala beautifully, and ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for the major things, the things that benefit you in this dunya and the thereafter. But here is the pearl of wisdom and the answer of the second thing that makes people disobey Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. وَلَا يَحْمِلَنَّكُمْ اسْتِبْطَاءَ الرِّزْقِ عَلَىٰ أَن تَأْخُذُوهُ بِمَعْصِيَةِ اللَّهِ. And do not use the excuse that you think that, hey, my fortune, things that I want are not happening fast enough, so you hasten that by disobeying Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Here it is. It's not happening fast enough. Let me disobey Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. فَإِنَّهُ لَا يُنَالُ مَا عِنْدَ اللَّهِ إِلَّا بِطَاعَتِهِ. For whatever that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has for you can never be gotten except by obeying Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Again, لا راحة إلا في الطاعة. There's no comfort, there's no quality of life except by obeying Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. You obey Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala like He wants to be obeyed, getting closer to Him and be loved by Him by doing the obligations upon you, the obligations of halal and the obligations of the things to abstain from, and then doing the rituals, getting closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will empower you, will aid you with His powers, and subhanallah, you will be immune in this dunya. You'll get everything in this dunya, insha'Allah, on your way to a paradise where everything is eternally pleasurable there for the wishing. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala make us of those who obey Him. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala make us of those who deserve to be the worshippers of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that would reside in His paradise eternally. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. والعصر إن الإنسان لفي خسر إلا الذين آمنوا وعملوا الصالحات وتواصوا بالحق وتواصوا بالصبر. وأن آخر دعوانا أن الحمد لله رب العالمين وجزاكم الله خيرا.